You've just finished building your first PC. You get it to post, you're in Windows, you're in the clear, right? Well, not really. There are actually 5 things that you should do after you get your PC booted, and it actually separates a lot of the pros from the beginners, because these 5 things are not necessarily things that you would think to do or would think are important when building a PC. So, without further ado, here are 5 things that you should do after you build your PC. Installing drivers is something that a lot of people start, but do not finish. You see, most people know to put video drivers into their system, as that is what enables dual screen use, or resolutions above 720p at times. Essentially, your video drivers are easy to notice if they're not working properly, but there are actually so many more that need to be updated once you install Windows. There are your chipset drivers, which can sometimes be the difference between a system running properly or a system running poorly when it comes to their CPU and GPU usage. There is the Ethernet and Wi-Fi driver, which can adjust how much speed goes through those adapters. You have your audio drivers, which can often sound horrible if the latest audio driver isn't even installed. You also have add-in card specific, like USB bus drivers or the capture card drivers that you're using. Not to mention your keyboards and mice all have their own software and driver packages that they have to use, especially if you use Razer products. Essentially, there's a lot to install, and unfortunately, it's a bit of a tedious process. But fortunately for you, Windows will search through and actually kind of auto-install as many of the drivers as it can. It actually has a master list that it's created that has the verified versions of the drivers, and it will install a version that is probably 1 or 2 generations behind the current one. That being said, it is best practice to go and find those drivers and update them as soon as you can. For most of the things that are on the motherboard, being chipset, audio, Wi-Fi, and Ethernet, those can all be found at the manufacturer's website. Simply locate the support tab for your correct motherboard and download the correct drivers from there. Asus, MSI, Gigabyte, BioStar even, they're all pretty easy to get to the drivers and support page. And with Asus, you can actually enable a one-click startup, which also installs some other software that you could use or get rid of later. For your keyboard and mice, those should install some sort of a basic version and start working immediately, but if you have to install something like iQ or Logitech game software or even Razer Synapsys, you do need to locate the manufacturer's website for that, and usually they have one big download that they do and all of it goes through there. Of course, your RGB will be handled by your motherboard vendor or by one of those other softwares that I've mentioned. And if you have an add-in sound card, of course, just locate the sound card manufacturer's website and find the support page for those drivers. Essentially, if your drivers aren't installed properly, that could be the difference between your PC being absolutely amazing or kind of sucky. You see, Ethernet and Wi-Fi drivers can actually make a huge difference on your performance. I have gigabit Ethernet, and my drivers, if they are acting up, will not use that gigabit properly. Essentially, everything else in the chain is running gigabit, and then the computer's outputting at like megabit speeds, which is not exactly ideal. Or how about the fact that this computer back here can actually switch between Ethernet and Wi-Fi on its own? After updating the Wi-Fi drivers, it actually has a feature which allows it to divert slower traffic or less important traffic over the Wi-Fi and keep things going through Ethernet. Well, these are features that would have been missing if I had not installed the drivers. Not to mention things like surround sound or cool lighting effects could all be absent if you don't update your drivers. Essentially, because Windows makes it easy, it's easy to forget to install them all. Installing utilities is something that a lot of people miss, unless you've built more than a few PCs. Essentially, those of us who are veteran builders know to install them pretty much as you're installing drivers. And that is because things go wrong. Things go wrong all the time with a computer, at the beginning, at the end of its life, and the easiest way to detect when things are starting to go wrong is using utilities. Utility tools range in variability from checking just CPU and GPU temperatures to VRM temperatures, all the way down to checking how your hard drives are performing. Essentially, tools like this exist because, well, Windows doesn't offer them. Windows does have some utilities built in. In fact, Task Manager is really good at kind of identifying programs that are hitting the CPU with load that shouldn't necessarily be doing so. If you're all of a sudden hearing your fans ramp up, it's second nature to just open up Task Manager and see why your CPU is running at like 50%. But that really doesn't tell you the whole story now, does it? In fact, your fans could be ramping up because your CPU is getting toastier than it should. And that could get pretty bad over time. Essentially, you'd need tools like CPU or GPUZ, which would allow you to see your temperatures, your VRM temperatures, your memory bus temperatures. GPUZ is actually my go-to tool for monitoring, as with the AM4 platform, all of it will report right through there. And I can look at everything at a glance with a piece of software that takes almost nothing out of my CPU. Other tools that are really good for checking this are MSI Afterburner. MSI Afterburner can be used in-game and overlay over your game so you can see exactly how much of your processor and GPU you're actually utilizing. Checking these tools will allow you to make sure that temperatures are in check, because stuff happens. Sometimes GPU manufacturers don't put a correct thermal paste or thermal pad, or sometimes you have a defect in your card. And it's better to know these things early because it's much easier to RMA something if you've never really used it than it is to RMA it after it's been used for a couple months. Essentially, checking your temps is extremely important. Other things though that you can install are things like Crystal Disk Info, which allows you to actually check your hard drive health. Hard drives die over time, and if you've used an old hard drive in a new system, it's going to probably die before the system does. So, using something like that will allow you to actually check to make sure things are running properly. And did you even know hard drives actually report their temperature? I know, it's incredible. Down below in the description, I am going to be listing all of the software that I recommend for monitoring. Stress testing your PC is another thing that a lot of people often forget to do, but once you have your utilities installed, it's kind of important. You see, your PC at idle might be perfectly fine, and while gaming, it might be perfectly fine, but then you start to try to do things like rendering, and you start to run into problems. That is because you didn't stress test your CPU. Stress testing CPUs and GPUs is actually very common and luckily does not void your warranty. Essentially, it's recommended by most manufacturers that you test your GPUs and CPUs properly before you really check your system off as complete. Now, for CPU stress tests, there are a couple of free softwares. Cinebench allows you to test your CPU in a very real rendering environment, but to really go for long periods of time, I recommend Blender. In fact, actually, we have an in-house Blender stress test called the Fuzzy Marble of Death. This thing is a sphere that has been subdivided 3 times, and then we added hair to it. We then lengthened the hair, added physics, and then switched the entire rendering engine to cycles. So, essentially, each frame is a Cinebench test. Every single one of them. And we have 280 of them. If your cooling holds up through that, it will hold up through anything. Granted, you don't really need all 280 frames. In fact, once you get to frame 50, you should have been able to test it adequately. It also allows you to check your CPU speeds and make sure that it's able to turbo for most of the time that it's being used, which is awesome. Also for GPU test, there are a couple of softwares. There is Furmark, which is pretty much what we did with Blender, except a fuzzy donut. I mean, it really is just the same thing that we did in Blender, but for your GPU. But there's also software like Unigine. Unigine Heaven and Superstition are very good at both benchmarking and stressing your PC. And if anything is going to go wrong, it's going to go wrong during one of these stress tests. You run a couple things of Unigine Heaven back to back to back on max graphics, your GPU should hit peak temperature. And again, you're checking to make sure things are working properly. Believe it or not, I personally, when building Supernova, made a mistake with the VRMs. I didn't have the thermal pad placed properly over my VRMs. The PC booted and ran perfectly fine for several hours at a time because it was still making contact with the cooler, but it wasn't making perfect contact with the cooler. And because of that, after about 2 hours of gaming or stress testing or benchmarking, I would eventually crash the whole thing with a VRM overheating. And that is kind of bad. VRMs can run hot, but under liquid, they should never be hitting the temperatures they were. And I noted that, and I observed it, and I observed it going up using my utilities and stress test. And it got to the point that I decided to take the whole thing apart and check what I did, and yes, I had made a mistake. Essentially, your stress test will allow you to check to make sure things are in check. Because if it doesn't survive the stress test, it's not going to survive long-term operation. And things only get worse over time for a computer. Once you hit year 1 or year 2, your thermal paste will start to wear. It will start to be less likely to conduct heat properly. Thermal pads can dry out. There are all sorts of things inside your GPU and your CPU that will become less efficient. And so essentially, you need to be checking this stuff when you first build your PC, because anything that's a problem now will only become a bigger problem later. And just a bit of a footnote in here, there is one more piece of software that I use regularly. It's 3D Mark, and it's actually both a stress test and benchmarking software. 3D Mark, unfortunately, is not free, as everything else I have mentioned is. In fact, regularly it goes for $30, but I bought mine for a single dollar during a Steam sale, so if you find it for that price, it's totally worth it. It's really good software for what it is. And it does work pretty well for testing your gaming performance. And it does stress test both the CPU and the GPU when it does its stress test. Benchmarking is something that a lot of people don't do. Unless you're like myself and you want to see those numbers, you're not going to do it. But you really should, because benchmarking will actually give you a quantitative number that you can then refer to when things start to age. In fact, every year I like to run the same set of benchmarks on a PC to make sure that they haven't degraded too much, or to know when I have to upgrade parts. Essentially, I run a suite of benchmarks on every PC I build, making sure that those PCs work properly. Cinebench, which we mentioned earlier, allows you to check your CPU score. This allows you to even compare it to like CPUs. Now, scores in differences of 100 are pretty normal, but if you are seeing like 1,000 points off your score, there's something wrong. Not to mention, things like Unigine also can be used to check your GPU and CPU performance. And honestly, those scores are extremely useful. We mentioned 3D Mark at the bottom of the last segment, and that is actually meant to check CPU and GPU and break it down easily. Again, if you can get it for cheap or for less than the $30, I would pick it up because it is easily the most useful tool I have when it comes to benchmarking, as it keeps all of my scores for every system and it breaks them down by system, by speed, by overclock, allowing me to see how each one stacks up. That being said, it does cost money, which is why I would recommend Unigine if you are on a budget, and if you need to just check CPU, Cinebench. Checking these scores is something that a lot of people don't do, and honestly, having these scores saved and committed to some sort of a document will make your life so much easier when it comes to later in your system's life. Not to mention, because many of them work as stress tests, if there's a problem, it will arise during those tests. This last one is a bit controversial. Overclocking is an easy way to get free performance. And honestly, in most cases, you really should use it. If you've paid for an expensive motherboard, if you've got high-end cooling, and you've got a processor that takes overclocks, go ahead and do it. Like, there is a reason that they make these parts the way they do. And in some cases, companies even encourage it. AMD is notorious for encouraging GPU and CPU overclocks on their systems. During the FX days, you could overclock that thing to 7 gigahertz. In fact, actually, DeBauer just did a video where he did 8 gigahertz on an FX processor. And they encouraged it because that's the only way that they would stay competitive with Intel. Not to mention, GPU overclocks are so easy in AMD software, it's like one button press. Now for NVIDIA, you do need a tool like MSI Afterburner, and that will allow you to tweak your GPU clocks from there. And you can even use it for AMD, but AMD is much easier through Radeon software and it's not an additional download. That being said, using those utilities and stress tests is the only way that you're gonna know if your overclocks were successful and stable. And trust me, if you're doing this properly, you want it to be stable. Maintaining nice temperatures is the easiest way to ensure that you're not going to kill your part and completely void your warranty by shoving too much current through it. Hypothetically, overclocking does shorten the life of the product, but I haven't been able to kill a single processor yet doing it, nor have I killed a single GPU overclocking. And I've been doing it for at least 10 years, so it's not exactly a commonplace thing. I mean, if you shoot a ton of voltage and a ton of temperature through something that can't take it, then yes, you're going to run into problems. But that is why you're stress testing. That is why you're monitoring. And that is why you're checking everything before you write your system off as complete. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, you can leave a like, comment, subscribe. I hope you guys learned something today. I honestly really had to think about this one because it's like I do this stuff as second nature as somebody who has built countless computers. I mean, in high school, we did this program where I actually built alongside some other people, I think over 150 computers that we just gave away to people who needed them. Of course, they were like old computers. In fact, they still have like one of them that I kept as a souvenir from the project. But I know for a fact that if I hadn't done things like that or hadn't built this computer or the one over here that I finished for Gamer Guts, I wouldn't be as versed on doing this. And I actually had to pick my own brain to like remember what I do in order to make sure that my systems run properly. Essentially, this stuff is stuff that you will get into the habit of doing if you're doing this a lot. It's super important and super useful. And then the last one, of course, is one that comes with its own risk. And I am going to just make sure to warn you guys that overclocking can be very risky. In fact, I recommend looking up what your processor's recommended overclock is, because that usually is a good mark to base your own system off of as well. Either way, thank you guys so much for watching. Again, Wolfie out.